Is there a good reason, a really good reason, to believe that Jesus came back from the dead? Our video maker today seems to think so, and I've agreed to throw in my 2 cents, and I'm going to be fair about this, but I'm not pulling my punches. I really wouldn't be getting my hopes up, though, but I'm going to give this an open mind and then explain why I'm likely not going to be impressed. I could be wrong, though, so let's go see. This one was a special request by the video maker, the Epitome Ministry. So if you see them down in the comments, say thank you for putting this out there. If I remember right, I had made a video, I don't even remember what video it was, but they came into the comments and asked if I would do one of theirs. They even picked the specific video, which is this one, and therefore here that is. Fair warning, I'm not pulling any punches just because the creator might be here, but I don't do that. It's nothing personal, I just don't have double standards. Also, I'm sorry it took so long. I told the Epitome Ministry that I had like a 2-month backlog, but it's actually longer than that since I have at least a month worth of videos written up front, and in this case, I had some longer videos to get out, which you've seen in the last couple of weeks. So this is going to be out there a very long time after the request came in, and I'm sorry, but it wasn't on purpose. So anyhow, let's get to it. I hope this is good.
Today I want to give you one really good reason to believe that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth happened.
Great, hit us with it. Now, I will say right now that I doubt this because, at least in my experience, which, keep in mind, that doesn't really mean anything in this case, but in my experience, I have seen exactly 6 seconds of this video so far, and in my experience, when the religious say things like this, it's only because they're smuggling in all of their theology and beliefs, whereas I'm not. I have nothing to smuggle in, and I am not going to take the things that you present, presumably because of course I haven't seen it yet, but I'm not going to take any of those things on faith. I am not going to believe it because you haven't supported it. Now, if he supports it, that's great, but I'm not holding my breath on that. This is really what I see a lot are the people who will say something and then in the back of their minds, they're just assuming the stuff in the Bible and the stuff that their church says and the stuff they read in books. They just assume all that's true, even though none of it has been rationally justified. I am not going to accept your unsupported, unjustified, unproven preconceptions. Just getting that out of the way up front. So what is your reason? Let's hear it.
Let's get into it. So, what is my one really good reason to believe the resurrection happened? It's the very fact that Christianity still exists today.
That's a really terrible reason. Lots of religions exist today. Does that mean that everything in their foundational myths and beliefs actually happened? Because I don't think you're going to agree. Did Muhammad actually split the moon in half just because Islam is still around today? That does not make that true, does it, though? So I'm not going to take your claim seriously if you're not going to take theirs. And I could go through tons of other examples of religions that are still hanging around out there, yet non-believers are going to reject all of the magical claims their theology makes because they are irrational. And let's be honest, the things the Christians say, they're irrational too. Then there's the big problem where you haven't actually proven anything. Just because you really like the idea, that doesn't make the idea true. Just because a lot of people really like the idea, that doesn't make it true either. You have to have actual evidential support, and sadly for you, you don't have a thing. Now, like I said, if he supports it, fantastic, but I've never seen a theist be able to do it yet. If you had a thing, you wouldn't need faith. You just trot that thing out. You wouldn't have a belief in it. You'd just be able to show that it actually happened. And I don't believe for a second that you can do that. So if this is what you're so proud of, then I'm just going to shake my head and walk away. Maybe he'll explain better. I don't know. So let's just keep going.
And I know you might be thinking, how is that a good reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the grave?
I think I already went into that because it really is a terrible reason. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what you can demonstrate to actually be true and be reasonable, using evidence to back it up. And sadly for the religious, they simply have nothing but wishful thinking and blind faith. I assume there's got to be more to it than this, though, since he's still got another 8.5 minutes of video. So let's get back to it and see what he has to say. Keep in mind that I think he's smuggling his theology in because they all do it. The second that comes up, and I will be sure to point it out, but the second that comes up, we're going to have a serious discussion. He might have made the video for other believers, but he specifically asked me, a non-believer, to review it. So this might not be pretty. Let's see.
I want to give you 3 facts that will hopefully help support this claim. The first fact is that political, social, and religious movements were common at the time of Jesus.
They're common today. There has never been a time in human history when they weren't common. So what? This really reminds me of Christians who think that Matthew 24, 6 through 13 means something. There will be wars and rumors of wars. Yeah, but when was that not true? But we're hearing about wars right now, and that proves the Bible is true. Hardly. The Matsala rebellion in North Borneo, the Somaliland campaign in Ethiopia, War of the Golden Stool, the Zande resistance, Muhammad Umar Khan's rebellion, the Hamawan revolt, the Sudan revolt, the French conquest of Borneo, fighting in Java, an uprising in southwest Madagascar, the Shobak revolt. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and those are just the wars in 1900, not the 1900s. That was one single year. And they're all like that. Somewhere there is always a war going on. Somewhere there are always rumors of wars going on. Just because you can read something into it, that doesn't mean that the Bible is worthwhile. That is not how this works.
And when their leaders were killed, the movements quickly dispersed and were never heard from again. And here are a few examples of this.
Before we get there, though, he is already clearly smuggling things into his assumptions. First off, he's assuming that Jesus ever existed at all, or that the stories in the Bible about Jesus are actually true. This is not externally defensible, because Jesus didn't actually start Christianity. Paul did. Paul ran around telling stories and converting people, and by the time Paul died, and we're not even sure who Paul was, because let's be honest, we have no external validation for Paul either, but there wasn't just one leader. By then, there were churches all over the place, each with their own leaders, and it didn't really matter what anyone believed, because everyone had their own take on the stories. Paul even said in his epistles to watch out for all the false leaders, because, that's been going on ever since. I think what he's trying to say, and he can certainly correct me if he'd like, but this is my take, is that a group like the Branch Davidians tend to go away after their charismatic leader dies. But in reality, the Branch Davidians, they're still out there, David Koresh or no. There are multiple groups out there right now that identify as Branch Davidian. Even if that's not exactly what he had in mind here, it still proves that even without a single leader, these things don't tend to just dry up and blow away if there are enough people with a committed faith behind it. So long as there are strong believers, they tend to stick around in one form or another.
Our first example is Judas of Galilee, who, alongside Zadok the Pharisee, started what is known as the Fourth Philosophy, or the Fourth Sect, which is more commonly referred to as the Zealots. They were Jewish nationalists who opposed giving taxes to Rome. After he was killed, the movement dissipated.
So, I've already given an example of one that didn't, and there are a ton of examples that I could provide. But you notice what he started with, not a religious movement, a political one. Political movements don't tend to be as fanatical as religious movements do, because once it becomes clear that the actual authorities can and will take you down, they tend to scatter because they're really after their own personal physical comfort, and they're not after something going on in heaven some other time. Religion tends to focus on benefits in the afterlife, whereas political movement tends to focus on benefits in the here and now. That's why the two are simply not comparable. Oh, and you want another example of a dead cult leader that didn't kill the cult? Ryuho Okawa, who started the Japanese cult Happy Science. He died in 2009, and Happy Science is still going strong. Now, he wasn't killed or anything, but the loss of the leader didn't remotely end the movement. And I can keep going with this too, because there are tons of examples. We'll see if there's a need moving forward for another couple, but I don't want to bore people.
Next is Theudas. He claimed to be a prophet who could divide the Jordan River. Josephus tells us that many were misled by him, and his movement was quickly quenched whenever the Romans had him beheaded.
I guess he wants to keep going. How about Abdullah al-Mahdi Bila, and I'm sorry, I probably massacred that, but he was head of a Muslim sect back in the 8th century CE. He declared himself to be the Mahdi, which is kind of a Muslim equivalent of a messiah of sorts. He died in 934 CE after being imprisoned by Saladin, who took over Egypt, the stronghold of the cult, and officially ended the caliphate. The beliefs still exist today and are a sub-branch of Shia Islam. Playing these games isn't going to get you anywhere because I have just as many examples as you do, probably more.
The next guy, I'm probably going to butcher his name. I'm going to pronounce it Athronges. Athronges led the Jews in a rebellion against Archelaus and the Romans that lasted about 2 years. He was eventually killed alongside his brothers, and just like the others, his movement was quenched.
Again, that's a political, not a religious movement. He was opposed to the Romans under Herod Archelaus, and we mostly know about him through the writings of Josephus. Interestingly, though, we don't actually know what happened to Athrons. Josephus wrote about the fate of his 4 brothers, but is completely silent on Athrons himself. It's not at all surprising that a political movement fell apart after their entire leadership was wiped out, but it's not impressive enough for a counterexample since I think I've already made my point.
Next is Simon of Perea. He too led military conquests against the Romans. According to Josephus, he burned down the royal palace at Jericho, set fire to many other of the king's houses in several places in the country, utterly destroying them.
Still political, not religious. Hopefully he's not just going to do the entire video of examples of other people who did stuff, because none of that actually demonstrates that Jesus came back from the dead. This is just a distraction, not evidence that Jesus ever rose. That's unfortunately very common with the religious because they don't actually have any real evidence. They just have stuff that they really like the sound of. But that doesn't mean anything. You need that evidence, and you don't have it. I probably should at least fast forward through any other examples because I think we've beat this horse to death at this point. I guess we'll have to see how it goes. We could go on all day trading examples back and forth, but none of that would show that Jesus ever did anything of substance. And isn't that the whole point of this video? The only reason to believe that Jesus came back from the dead is if you have evidence that Jesus came back from the dead. Not arguments, not wishes and dreams, not "it sounds good to me," but evidence. So let's get to that because nothing less will do.
But he was quickly overtaken by Herod's infantry and beheaded. There's also some speculation around Simon of Perea that he claimed to be the Messiah.
Well, that's just additional information, so I'm going to let that one go. And claiming to be the Messiah was pretty common back in the day. It was a quick way to get attention for your cause, and Judas of Galilee, no, not that Judas, a different one, Theudas, Simon of Perea, and Athrons, they all gave it a shot in the first century. It's never really stopped, though. There are still people to this very day claiming to be messiahs among the Jews. Among the more recent were Moses Gibbery, who lived until 1985, who led a British-Israeli cult in the United States, and Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who lived until 1994, whose followers thought he was the Jewish Messiah. His cult is still out there today and growing. According to some followers, Schneerson never really died. He's just out there someplace. I don't know if it's in hiding, but he's just out there someplace still alive. This is the kind of thing that religion does to you. It makes you take all leave of your senses. I guess this is another case of a dead Messiah figure whose movement didn't end with his death. And in Schneerson's case, it only got larger.
And finally, in the 2nd century, we have Simon Bar Kokhba.
Okay, one last one. Seriously, after this, I'm done. But you notice that all of the examples he's giving, they're all political movements, not religious ones, right? I've already explained why that's a problem and why, ultimately, none of this matters at all. But sure, go ahead and get it out of your system, and I'll see you on the other side.
Who started what is known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 CE against the Roman Empire. He established a Jewish state for about 3 years before being killed by Roman troops, and many thought him to be the Messiah, including Rabbi Akiva, who was a prominent Jewish rabbi at the time.
That is all relatively accurate as far as it goes. Rabbi Akiva used a number of Bible verses claiming that they were prophecies of the coming Kokhba. You have to remember that in Jewish tradition, at least at the time, they saw the Messiah as someone who would come and save the Jews from the Romans, not as a spiritual leader. Certainly, nobody would have expected any of these examples to have come back from the dead or do miracles or anything like that. They were just human beings doing human being stuff, perhaps with the claimed approval of their imaginary friend in the sky, but these were not magical men doing magical things like Jesus turned out to be. So how does any of this actually support the miraculous resurrection of a failed apocalyptic preacher at the beginning of the 1st century CE? It doesn't. It doesn't do anything at all. It doesn't lend any credence to it whatsoever unless you embrace a whole bunch of unjustified, nonsensical beliefs first, which the religious have to do. But I'm not doing it, though. I'm waiting for evidence, which I don't think is forthcoming. Wonder why?
And after Bar Kokhba was killed, just like the others, his movement was quenched when the Romans really cracked down on the Jewish people. N.T. Wright adds, in the 1st century and the roughly 50 years around either side of it, we know of 10 or a dozen other Jewish messianic or quasi-messianic movements, and we know those movements came to an end with the violent death of the founder or the key figure.
Because they weren't religious movements. If you limit this to only religious movements, you get a very different story. Romans at the time worshipped their emperors as gods, which was really common throughout the ancient world. When those leaders died, their following didn't evaporate. People still believed. The same went for the worship of Egyptian pharaohs. The problem with all of his examples, one of the problems anyway, is that he's just describing cults of personality, not religious belief systems. Without the charismatic leaders, there was nothing left to do. The political movements just moved on to other charismatic leaders. Whereas the next guy that came along that said they'd take on the Roman Empire, the same kind of people just signed up there because they weren't really in it for the leader. They just wanted to get rid of Rome. That's not the case with Jesus or any of the examples that I've given. There, you had an entire belief system that didn't revolve only around the individual in question. You didn't need a physical Jesus to believe all the supernatural crap that Christianity claimed. Christianity transcended Jesus, just like Islam transcended Abdullah al-Mahdi Billah. You don't need the guy. You just need the belief. And that's why this point is all so pointless. He doesn't understand what's actually going on.
And when that happened, if you were a follower of that movement, you had a choice. Either give up the movement or find a new Messiah. Fascinatingly, the Jewish groups that followed Jesus of Nazareth didn't do either of those things. They continued the movement, and they said, astonishingly, that the recently crucified Jesus was the Messiah.
Somebody remind me, have we done any N.T. Wright stuff around here? I mean, directly. I know he's been mentioned in passing, but if anyone has a good article or a video on Wright, let me know. Maybe I'll do it. However, what he read just reinforces my point. The political movements needed the charismatic leader, and once that leader was gone, people had to move on, either to another leader somewhere else or just into oblivion. That's not how religion works, though, since the religion isn't really about the leader. The leader is just a figurehead. The actual meat of the beliefs have very little to do with the leader at all. And that's why all of his examples fail, because there you need the guy, whereas with religion, the guy is largely irrelevant. The guy is just somebody you look at and say, there's the guy, and then you go off and believe all kinds of other stuff on your own. It's why most theists have faith in faith, not faith in anything demonstrably real. That's just what they want to believe. But wanting to believe is simply not enough.
And interestingly enough, if you read the Gospels, you'll see that the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. In Luke 24, Jesus is speaking to two disciples on the road to Emmaus, and he said, "What are these words you're exchanging with one another as you're walking?" And they came to a stop, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you possibly the only one living near Jerusalem who does not know about the things that happened in these days?"
Now, normally, I would just fast forward through Bible verses because they don't really mean a thing. My book says a thing is irrelevant. These are just stories, not demonstrable truths. This is another example of beliefs being smuggled in because they just really want to believe. Here, though, I'm going to let it slide because it doesn't matter if it ever happened or is just a story thrown in because it makes a point. We see the religious pulling that one all the time, right? A very long time ago now, we did a video of a young Christian who claimed that he converted a lady to Christ in a liquor store. And let me know if you still remember that one because I hardly remember it myself. But he was just standing there outside the liquor store, but he didn't put her on camera. He didn't interview her. We have no reason whatsoever to believe any of it. It was just a just so story told because it made the tale more attractive to his intended religious audience. But that doesn't make any of it true. And that's why I reject this stuff, because I need the actual justification, not the empty claims. The claims mean nothing. Only the facts do. So anyway, he was telling a story. Let's get back to that. I want to get through his first point, if I can, before we wrap up for the week.
And he said to them, "What sort of things?" And they said to him, "Those about Jesus the Nazarene, who proved to be a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is now the third day since all these things happened."
And if you read the stories, there were a lot of people who were expecting Jesus to be a political leader, not a spiritual one. In fact, a lot of the stories in the Gospels are just a means to salvage the Jesus tales from oblivion, since he supposedly died without accomplishing anything of any demonstrable merit. So they put a spin on it. But that's not what it really meant. And today, we're still dealing with the results of those bald rationalizations. You've got to remember that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses to anything. They were written by people with the benefit, in big air quotes, of decades of a giant game of telephone and wishful thinking that no one can actually demonstrate is true. These are folk tales, nothing more. It's interpretation of stories that were commonplace in the culture, but that doesn't mean that any of it actually happened. The religious just assume it because they have a vested emotional interest in doing so. But I don't have that problem. I see it as it actually seems to be, as most secular Bible scholars see it. We don't have that indoctrinated mind poisoning hanging around like a millstone around our necks. That's why none of this is at all impressive to people who don't already have that faith. This shouldn't be impressive to anyone. And for anyone who's actually impressed, you need to take a solid look at it because you're doing intelligence wrong.
So, we have all these messianic or quasi-messianic movements that came to an end with the death of their leader. And it appears the Jesus movement was going to suffer a similar fate. But what changed?
The believers rewrote their expectations. Instead of being a political movement, it morphed into a theological one. Well, he didn't really come to save you from the Romans. He came to save you from your sins. The stories that were written down about it had a distinctly theological bent. But that doesn't mean anything. It just makes it an interesting claim. But it doesn't make any of it real. So we're right back where we started, with none of this actually proving that Jesus rose from the dead, or let's be honest, existed at all, because this isn't about having a really good reason to believe in the resurrection. It is, as with most apologist attempts, just a bald rationalization to get them where they really want to go. Now, I'm going to arbitrarily stop right here and pick up with his next words in the next video. Sometimes you just have to do that because these things will get too long otherwise. I was hoping for a more definitive stopping point, but we're getting long and I have to consider where to cut this for future videos, so I'm just making an executive decision here and stopping it right here because. Don't worry, we'll come back with his very next word, but I wanted to ask what you thought so far. Has this been a worthwhile point? I don't think so, but I've had plenty of time to explain why, so now is your chance. Let me know down in the comments what you think. And maybe the epitome will come along and throw in his views, I don't know. So far, this has just not been impressive because it doesn't actually demonstrate anything remotely related to the supposed resurrection of Jesus. Well, this stuff over there, if you squint just right and haul in all your religious preconceptions along with you, well, it just might make you think you have a good reason. But you don't. You just don't. You only have faith. And faith doesn't mean anything. The only good reason to believe in the resurrection would be evidence. And sadly, the religious just don't have any. That's why they have to play these games. It's why they just have to play make-believe. It's why they have to baldly rationalize. And I'm sorry, but this is never going to impress anyone who isn't also hauling around all that baggage. The failure is theirs. It always has been, and it always will be. What else is new? See you next time.